This is a history video which looks at the importance of the American economy. Now this is hard. This is complicated stuff. Economics is a very specialised area. I struggle with it. I just about scraped through A-level economics and didn't understand a great deal of it. But if I can make sense of it, and so can you. And let's face it, if Ronald Reagan can convince people that he knew what he was talking about with the economy, we've all got a chance of understanding this. Key to judging the success of any American president is their performance with the economy. In this period, from the 70s through the 80s and 90s, the American economy is going through a quite dramatic period of change. Americans had been used to having this very strong economy, the strongest in the world. And by 1970, that's not really the case anymore. The 1960s had left the American economy in quite desperate difficulties. This is largely the legacy of a number of factors and policy decisions which were long-term. The Cold War was a major drain on American finances because Americans had given a commitment to financially support countries around the world to try and hold off the spread of communism, and that had been going since 1946. There was also American military involvement in Vietnam, which had increased since 1965. There was a huge investment in NASA and space exploration, and Americans were determined to be the first to put a man on the moon. But that's not cheap, and there's no real financial gain from being first on the moon. There's nothing there that you can sell. And also during the 1960s, firstly under Kennedy and then under Lyndon Johnson, American spending on welfare had dramatically increased, and largely that's a consequence of the civil rights movement. So that's the context for the presidents of the 1970s. They're coming to term at a time when the American economy is at its weakest point for maybe 100 years. So let's look at how, first of all, Ford and Carter fared. We don't have to spend too much time on them. Most exam questions will focus on Reagan. Ford is just really unlucky. I mean, he's coming in at a difficult time anyway, when the image and reputation of the president is at an all-time low. He's inheriting a huge inflation problem, which has been made worse by rising oil prices. Well, those problems were there anyway, but Watergate and the end of the Vietnam War had largely distracted attention away from it, and distracted attention away from how badly the American economy was actually doing. Almost immediately after Ford became president, unemployment rose to over 5.5%. Nothing to do with him, it just happened. It was going to happen anyway. But people who were looking very confused and scared were looking at Ford and expecting him to do something about it. Ford, first of all, wanted to raise taxes in an attempt to combat inflation, and then he decided to cut them. So he looked indecisive. He looked as if he didn't know what he was doing. And to be fair, Jerry Ford didn't know what he was doing. He's not an economist. He never pretended to be anything else. But people expected him as president to be an economist and to understand what he was talking about. And he's faced with a problem that very few presidents have ever had to deal with. And he's not alone in not knowing how to do it. But his poor performance, or his lack of performance on the presidency, costs him the election in 1976, and Jimmy Carter wins. But Carter's not going to do much better. I mean, he's coming in with a time of staggering inflation, increasing unemployment, and, worst of all, rising energy prices. The inflation means that mortgages, loans, food and energy have all become more expensive. Now, he tried to stop that by decreasing government expenditure, holding down federal workers' wages and through price controls. That was unpopular with just about everybody. Workers, businessmen, Congress, everybody was attacking him, which built up this sense of crisis and a sense that he wasn't providing leadership. He appointed Paul Volcker as chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. And the Federal Reserve Board is sort of the American version of the Bank of England. It controls the amount of money that's in circulation. Now, Volcker was a good appointment, and he curbed the money supply. He reduced the amount of money that was available. Now, that was the right thing. It will and did improve the economy, but it's not a quick fix. It, in the short term, might actually worsen the problem, which it did, and added to Carter's unpopularity. The revival, when it came under Reagan, and Reagan gets the plaudits and the praise for it, even though he had absolutely nothing to do with it, except he kept Volcker there. Carter was also hit by the energy crisis. America had been self-sufficient on energy since World War II, but that oil was running out, and they were increasingly dependent on Middle Eastern oil. By 1976, over half of American oil was being imported. Now, there was a very hard winter between 1976 and 77 that led to a shortage of fuel supplies and led to schools and factories having to close because they couldn't heat. Long queues at petrol stations, and there was America's first energy riot, a place called Levittown in Pennsylvania in 1977. His lack of performance on the economy again cost Carter the election. Reagan won in 1980, and the economy was a big part of his election campaign. Reagan was great at the one-liners, and one of his best in that election campaign was when he defined economic terms as a recession is when your neighbour loses his job, a depression's when you lose your job, and recovery is when Jimmy Carter loses his. In his January 1981 State of the Union address, Reagan made it very clear of his four aims. Firstly, to revive the economy by decreasing taxes. This would encourage people to work harder and buy more. Secondly, to reduce the size and role of the government by cutting public spending and minimising welfare state arrangements. Thirdly, deregulating state and federal government requirements. And fourthly, to strengthen the nation's defences. This becomes known as Reaganomics and dominates Reagan's first term as president. It's backed by an economic theory known as supply side. The theory is that if taxes are cut, then the amount of money available to individuals and businesses increases. Some of that money will hopefully be used for investment. That investment promotes more work because more machines will be built, new factories and new products will be created. That will create a demand for more workers. With all of this new productivity and this new output, profits will increase, therefore more taxes can be paid. As another result of that, everyone's got more money. Workers, managers, businessmen have more personal income. They'll spend it. That stimulates a demand for more goods and services. Even Reagan's budget director, a guy called David Stockman, admitted that it didn't really work, this plan. It's pretty thin in terms of theory. It's a little bit all over the place. But it's the plan that Reagan's going with. Now, to get this program through, Reagan needs the support of thousands of bureaucrats in departments of state and federal agencies. His chief of staff, Edwin Meese, made sure that over 2,000 lower-level political positions went to candidates who sympathised with Reaganomics. So this is a policy that is going to get put through. Now, Reagan tried to achieve economic change through cutting back on government spending. He drastically cut the number of staff employed in regulatory agencies by over 29%, and this has a huge effect. For example, he cut the staff of the Consumer Product Safety Commission by 38%. Sounds great, but that does lead to a 50% fall in prosecutions for the illegal disposal of hazardous waste. So the amount of hazardous waste that is being illegally disposed increases. So the effects on the environment are huge. Reagan asked Congress to approve a plan which will allow him to lower taxes, increase defence spending by $7.2 billion, but cut $40 billion of funding from government expenditure. Congress approved it. They reduced the budget of 212 federal programmes, most of which aided the working poor. It included things like food stamps, student loans and child nutrition programmes. The Economic Tax Recovery Act of 1981 that Reagan pushed through cut all personal income tax by 25% over 3 years. Corporation tax, which is the tax that businesses pay, it's like the big version of income tax, was also cut. That's the biggest tax cut in American history. It does mean that the rich keep more of their income than ever before, and that far less money will go into the federal budget. Reagan was able to get this through and for a number of reasons. He had a very clear sense of direction and priorities. With Reagan, he did one thing at a time. Critics argued that he couldn't really think of more than one thing at a time, but actually in political manoeuvring, it's not a bad way to go through things. His popularity was sky high. He survived an unsuccessful assassination attempt in 1981, which made it very difficult for anyone to vote against him. He gave a very impressive television address to Congress 2 days before Congress was due to vote, and his staff targeted congressmen's districts with radio and TV adverts, mail and telephone blitzes, very, very skillful and sophisticated grassroots lobbying. And Reagan was at the height of his powers. He was charming, he was amiable, he was humorous, he was relaxed, he made fun of himself as much as anything else. And it's really this period that he builds up his reputation as the great communicator. The press were pretty good to Reagan as well, but he worked at that. He was always very polite to the press, he was always very obliging, he always stopped to answer questions. The economic plan struggles, though. In 1982, the budget deficit is $200 billion. Now, Reagan could either suspend tax cuts or cut back on defence spending, and both of those were unacceptable to him. So instead, he just cuts back on welfare and social programmes instead, even further. The things that he cuts are things that particularly affect the poor, particularly therefore affect black, poor children, school meals, education, support for single parents, aid for cheap mortgages. Those are the things that go. But the budget deficit did continue to grow. Federal income was spent on a huge defence programme to, in Reagan's words, make America number one again. $1.2 trillion was spent on the Star Wars Strategic Defence Initiative, which was a sort of bizarre plan to put satellites and laser weapons in space, which would stop incoming missiles. $1.2 trillion was spent on it, and it never worked. Federal investment continued to support things like agriculture, energy producers, and the elderly, the big traditional supporters of the Republican Party. Very little was spent on health, education, and the inner cities. Inner cities tend to be where Democrat supporters are. There were huge reductions in federal regulations in healthcare, the workplace, and the environment. There were claims that this would lead to huge environmental damage fell on deaf ears with Reagan. Having taken away most of the protection for forests, Reagan said that, quote, "A tree's a tree, how many more do you need to look at?" His first 2 years were difficult for the economy, but by 1984 things had improved. But that's largely because oil prices had dropped, and that's largely because America had found more oil. They'd found more supplies of oil in their own territories. So it's not really stuff that Reagan's done. It's not really down to his policies. It's down to the tough supply of money which Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve Board had done. It's down to the discovery of new oil resources. But the key thing is it looks like Reagan's responsible. It looks like he's done something, and that's something his supporters were very keen to promote. The defence expenditure sort of gives you lots of big things to look at as well, and it looks very glossy and exciting, and looks as if America's spending money wisely. And also it does bring prosperity to those regions which have defence and aerospace industries, the West Coast. Reagan was re-elected easily in 1984, largely because his first term was seen as a success, partly because there was a huge feel-good factor from the Los Angeles Olympics. Reagan, as a former governor of California, Reagan as a former Hollywood film star, had a very high profile at the Olympics, and largely because his rival for the Democratic Party, Walter Mondale, ran one of the worst election campaigns in history. Have a look at what happens to Bush and Clinton in the notes in your textbook. I hope this video has been of some use to you. Thank you very much.